Okay, so you're someone who wants to get the full picture right, but without spending like hours wading through dense reports.
Yeah, you want those aha moments where things just click.
Exactly. Well, this deep dive is designed pretty much for you. Think of it as your shortcut to understanding the pretty complex state of UK immigration right now.
And today, we are really digging deep into the whole UK immigration landscape. We've pulled together a lot of different sources, trying to get a proper handle on it.
We really have. We're looking at, breaking news from the BMJ, some academic stuff, comparing perceptions versus reality. We've got analysis of political manifestos.
There's also a personal immigrant story in there, which is quite powerful.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Plus a detailed briefing paper, public opinion data, and even some projections looking ahead at future trends.
So our mission, if you like, is to get past the usual headlines. We want to pull out the key facts, maybe some surprising things you don't always hear.
And just really grasp the different perspectives, move beyond the surface stuff. Okay, so let's dive right in. There's some very recent news, isn't there? Just yesterday, the government put out this white paper, Restoring Control Over the Immigration System.
That's the one. And it sounds like a big shift.
It does. What's the key takeaway?
Well, the big headline policy is that they're immediately stopping new applications for social care visas from overseas.
Immediately?
Wow. Why? Their stated reason is, and I'm quoting here, significant concerns over abuse and exploitation of individual workers.
Okay. So the government line is they want to move away from relying on overseas workers in care. And they're saying they'll tackle low pay and bad conditions some other way, like fair pay agreements.
Exactly. That's the plan, or at least the stated plan. It sounds, reasonable in the face of it. Tackling exploitation is important.
But, I sense a but coming.
Well, yeah. Almost straight away, leaders in the social care sector basically sounded the alarm. The BMJ reported they're warning this poses a huge risk.
The huge risk to what? To care itself?
To social and healthcare provision. They called international recruitment a lifeline. Cutting it off. Well, you can see the problem.
A lifeline. That's strong language. So the worry is this move, meant to stop exploitation, could actually damage the services people rely on, including the NHS.
Precisely. It throws that core tension into really sharp relief, doesn't it? Policy aims versus potential unintended consequences.
It really does.
Yeah.
And this leads us nicely into something else you mentioned, this gap between what people think about immigration and what the sort of data actually says.
Yeah, this perception gap is, well, it's pretty significant. Public opinion, based on the sources we looked at, is quite divided overall.
Divided how?
Well, for instance, back in April 2023, a majority, 52%, said they wanted lower immigration numbers.
And has that feeling grown? Because it feels like it's talked about more.
It seems so. There was definitely an uptick in concern from late 2022. It actually peaked in October 2024. 38% of people said immigration was the top issue. That's the highest it's been in 8 years.
Okay, and that coincided with, record high net migration figures and lots of focus on small boats and things like that?
That's right. High net migration, lots of media and political attention on irregular migration, housing asylum seekers, all feeding into it. But it's important to remember public views aren't monolithic. People make distinctions.
Ah, right. They prefer certain types of migrants over others.
Exactly. There's a clear preference for highly skilled workers. But interestingly, even with that desire for lower numbers overall, a majority actually support making it easier for healthcare workers to come here.
Which ties right back into the NHS concerns we just talked about.
It does. And it's not just healthcare. Even for roles often labeled low-skilled care workers, again, farm workers, construction, there's significant public support for easing migration.
Yeah.
People seem to recognize we need them.
So it's complex. Who tends to be more positive, generally?
The data suggests younger people, those with degrees, and labor voters tend to have more positive views on immigration.
But still, those worries about pressure on services are widespread, aren't they? You mentioned the NHS, 70% think immigration puts extra pressure on it.
Yeah, that figure comes up. And similar concerns about housing, schools, other infrastructure. It seems a lot of this is driven by, intuition, personal experiences, what people see in the news or online.
Okay, so that's the perception side. What about the reality, according to the research? Let's start with the economy. Does immigration boost it? Harm it?
Well, the analysis generally shows that higher net migration does tend to boost overall GDP. Makes sense. More people working and consuming. It might also help lower public debt as a share of GDP over time.
But what about GDP per person? Does it make individuals better off?
Ah, that's where it's less clear. The effect on GDP per capita is generally found to be small and pretty uncertain. Not a huge impact either way, according to most studies.
Okay. And the really big one, does it hurt jobs or wages for people already here?
This is probably the most studied aspect. And the consistent finding across, well, numerous academic studies is that overall, immigration doesn't have a significant negative impact on the pay or employment of UK-born workers.
No significant impact, really, even with high numbers.
Not overall. There might be a tiny negative effect on the very lowest earners and potentially a small positive one for the highest earners. But the general consensus is the impact is tiny.
So that common fear about immigrants taking jobs or driving down wages, the data doesn't really back it up on a large scale.
Not in a significant way, no. The picture is much more nuanced. It suggests maybe we should focus less on just the number and more on the skills coming in, where they're needed, how integration works.
Right, it's not just volume. What about the pressure on public services then? That NHS concern?
Well, there was a key report by the Migration Advisory Committee back in 2018. It actually found that, on average, migrants contribute more through taxes and things like the NHS surcharge than they take out in health and social care services.
How does that work?
Migrants, especially those arriving through legal work or study routes, tend to be younger and healthier on average than the general population. So they use services less, initially at least, but they're paying taxes and the surcharge.
Okay, that's interesting. And crime? Is there a link?
Research looked at the big wave of EU migration after 2004. It found basically no impact on overall crime rates up to 2013.
No impact at all.
Not on the overall rates. Now, there is some evidence suggesting slightly higher rates of property crime among asylum seekers specifically. But, and this is crucial, it's strongly linked to poverty and the fact they often can't legally work. The rates are similar to equally disadvantaged UK-born groups. Importantly, there's no evidence of any effect on violent crime rates.
So context is really important there.
Absolutely. And we also need to remember, the vast majority of people coming to the UK arrive through legal routes, work visas, study visas. The irregular channel crossings, the small boats, they get a lot of attention, but they're a small fraction of the total flow.
Okay, so if the data often paints this different picture, why the persistent gap? You mentioned the spectacular politics of crisis earlier. What's that about?
Yeah, it's about how the issue is framed. Politicians, parts of the media often present immigration, especially the irregular kind, as this immediate, dangerous crisis.
Yeah.
It's visually very potent.
Creates a narrative.
Exactly, a narrative that often positions certain migrants as problematic, maybe even a threat, and positions certain segments of the native population as victims of this crisis.
Like crisis work. You mean politicians deliberately focus on negative things, like the exploitation concerns with care visas, to justify policies? Even if those policies have other knock-on effects.
That's the argument, yes. It allows them to justify quite dramatic policy shifts. Look at the intense focus on small boats.
Right, even though, as you said, it's a small part of the overall numbers.
Precisely. And then there's the language of fairness. You hear it a lot, especially from MPs in those so-called red wall areas.
What do they mean by fairness in this context?
Often it's articulating constituents' feelings that it's unfair that resources are spent on supporting irregular arrivals, or that the system isn't fair to hardworking local people. And underlying a lot of it is the idea that irregular migration challenges national sovereignty, the control of borders.
Okay, red wall representatives, just to clarify, that's generally MPs for constituencies that traditionally voted Labour but have shifted more conservative recently, yeah.
That's the typical usage, yes. Areas often seen as feeling left behind or whose concerns weren't being heard previously.
Understood. So this framing links into the actual policy proposals we're seeing. Let's look at what the main parties are suggesting based on their manifestos. What's Labour's approach on work migration?
Labour talks about reducing net migration overall. They want to link immigration policy much more closely with skills policy, training people here. They plan to reform the points-based system, give the Migration Advisory Committee more clout.
That's the independent body that advises the government.
Yes. And develop specific workforce plans for sectors like social care. A big emphasis for them is cracking down on employers who abuse the visa system. They're also proposing a single enforcement body to protect workers' rights, including migrants, covering things like travel time pay for care workers.
Okay. What about the Liberal Democrats?
They're proposing a more flexible, merit-based system. They want to scrap the hostile environment policies.
Those were the policies aimed at making life difficult for undocumented migrants, right?
That's them. Lib Dems also want to invest more in tackling illegal working and smuggling gangs. And importantly, they'd reverse the ban on dependents for care workers and exempt NHS and care staff from the immigration skills charge.
That's the fee employers pay.
Yeah, when they sponsor a foreign worker. They also have an idea about a new dependent contractor status for gig economy workers, giving them basic rights.
And the Greens. Their focus seems broader, on worker rights generally.
Very much so. Their proposals include repealing anti-union laws, a maximum pay ratio in companies, a 15-pound minimum wage. They want equal rights for all workers from day one, including gig workers, plus proper funding for enforcement, pay gap audits, safe sick pay, a 4-day week eventually, and specifically boosting pay and careers in social care.
Lots of focus on worker conditions there. Finally, Reform UK. Their approach sounds quite different.
It is. They propose a freeze on what they call non-essential immigration.
What counts as essential?
They make exceptions, mainly for some healthcare roles. They also want a 5-year residency requirement before immigrants can claim benefits, and higher national insurance for employers hiring foreign workers, though with exemptions for small businesses and healthcare.
And they also have views on employment law itself.
Yes, they argue current laws make it too hard to hire and fire people, and that this holds back business growth, so they favor deregulation there.
Okay, quite a range of proposals. But it's easy to get lost in policy and stats. You mentioned a personal story.
Yes, from wanderinghelene.com. It's a powerful reminder of the human reality behind the numbers.
What does it describe?
It talks about the initial excitement of moving to London, full of hope, but then the reality hitting the difficulty finding meaningful work despite being qualified, the feeling of being an outsider, just an immigrant.
That feeling of hitting a wall despite skills and enthusiasm.
Exactly. It really highlights that gap between the jobs immigrants are often seen doing service roles, maybe, and the barriers they face getting into other fields. It connects the policy debates directly to individual lives, frustration, and sense of belonging.
Yeah, that's crucial context. Now, we also have this briefing document, the UK Immigration Landscape 1.
Yeah.
Does it pull these threads together? What are its main takeaways?
It does summarize a lot of what we've touched on. It flags that big jump in the salary threshold for work visas up to £38,700 for many roles now. It mentions the Illegal Migration Act from 2023, the whole Stop the Boats agenda. Concerns about the move to digital-only immigration status, the need to make sure that's fair and doesn't exclude people. It also notes Scotland's push for its own immigration powers due to different demographic needs.
And it brings up that politics of crisis idea again.
Yes, it talks about that framing, the sometimes contradictory way migrants are portrayed. It points out the use of fairness and resentment in political messages, often alongside dismissing accusations of racism and framing it as a culture war issue instead.
Does it mention the immigrant experience, too?
It does. It touches on experiences of discrimination, the bureaucratic hurdles people face, and again, that disconnect between public worries about services and integration versus what the data often shows. It also mentions the nuance needed with CRAB stats for asylum seekers, linking it to disadvantage, and the whole debate over words like illegal versus irregular.
Okay, so that briefing echoes a lot of our discussion. Going back to public opinion specifically, what else did that source tell us?
Well, it reinforced the divided views, the recent rise in concern, but also those important distinctions people make between different migrant groups. And interestingly, compared to some other European countries, UK attitudes are actually relatively positive overall.
Relatively positive,
Yeah.
despite the headlines.
Seems so, on average. And it really stressed that contradiction again. General worry about low-skilled migration, but then specific support for workers in roles like care, even if they are classified that way.
It shows how labels can be misleading, perhaps.
Definitely. And it also made the point that just asking people about immigrants in polls can be tricky because that word alone can conjure up very different images for different people. The wording really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's look ahead. What do the projections say about future migration? The Migration Observatory thinks the recent highs might not last.
That's their analysis, yes. They stress that net migration, the difference between people arriving and leaving, is key, and emigration often lags behind immigration trends.
So people who arrived might start leaving later, bringing the net figure down.
Exactly. Their projection is that net migration is likely to fall from that 2022 peak. It could potentially get back down to pre-Brexit type levels by around 2032.
Why the expected fall?
Mainly driven by recent policy changes expected to reduce work and study visas, like the ban on dependents for care workers and tighter rules for students bringing family.
But these are just projections, right?
Yeah.
There must be uncertainty.
Oh, absolutely. They depend on assumptions, like how long migrants actually stay. But interestingly, the Migration Observatory says that even if immigration levels stay quite high, net migration is still projected to fall because they expect emigration to rise.
More people leaving offsets those arriving.
That's the idea. And another point they make, the post-Brexit system, while different, might not necessarily lead to lower net migration than we saw in the mid-2010s. That's because increases in non-EU work and study migration have sort of balanced out the fall in EU migration.
Fascinating. Now, finally, we have to touch on the latest political language. Keir Starmer's announcement yesterday, calling past policies a failed experiment in open borders, a squalid chapter.
Yes, that's pretty strong rhetoric.
And he proposed specific changes. Higher English tests, longer wait for citizenship.
That's right. Higher English standards for some visas and a 10-year wait before applying for citizenship. The stated goal is clearly to reduce overseas worker recruitment, especially for lower-skilled jobs.
It sounds very much like that spectacular politics of crisis framing we discussed. Defining the past as a failure to justify new, tougher measures.
It certainly fits that pattern.
Yeah.
And it really pushes us to ask, based on all the evidence we've looked at, the economic data, the impact on services, public opinion nuances, does it really stack up as a failed experiment, or is the reality more complicated?
A critical question indeed. Now, to add another layer, we dipped into a Reddit discussion on ruck politics. What kind of unfiltered views came up there?
It was, as you'd expect, a real mix. Lots of debate. Some people argued strongly for selective immigration, focusing on skills needed rather than zero immigration. Discussions about context needing to consider birth rates, the number of pensioners, cost of living when comparing migration now versus historically. Some pointed fingers at university funding models driving international student numbers or corporate hiring practices. Rent costs came up a lot, obviously.
Any pushback against the purely economic arguments?
Yes, some users argued that just talking about GDP benefits ignores the stress or anxiety for native workers feeling they face more competition. There was disagreement, too, on whether current high levels are just a blip caused by recent events or a new normal.
And the tone of the debate itself.
Familiar territory, really. People complaining. It's hard to have an honest conversation because of accusations of racism flying around, debates about cultural integration, values with mentions of religion, feminism as points of friction sometimes. The illegal versus irregular terminology was argued over, too.
What about crime and the economy in that discussion?
Similar points to the main sources, but debated more fiercely. Concerns about crime stats, but also pushback about comparing asylum seekers fairly with disadvantaged natives. Varied opinions on economic impacts. Does it hurt lower earners more? Arguments for basing policy on evidence versus just gut feelings.
Did they notice the political shift?
Oh, yeah. The observation that pretty much all main parties are now promising lower immigration was definitely made. And interestingly, a few anecdotes, though, just anecdotes about working conditions actually improving in some sectors right after Brexit, although others strongly disagreed.
So a snapshot of the public debate, messy, passionate, full of different angles. We should stress, though, it's a Reddit forum, not a scientific poll.
Absolutely. It just gives a flavor of the arguments happening out there.
So wrapping this deep dive up, it's clear UK immigration is just incredibly complex, isn't it? So many interacting parts.
Definitely. We've seen new policies, the gap between public perception and data, the political framing, the different party platforms, the human stories.
And that ongoing debate about where we're heading, it's dynamic, constantly shifting.
Absolutely. Economic factors, social changes, political winds, they all shape this landscape.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Considering everything we've explored, the data, the stories, the politics, what do you think the real priority should be for UK immigration policy? And perhaps, how can we have a more productive conversation about it? One that maybe bridges that gap between perception and reality.
Yeah, how do we move the discussion forward? It's something that's clearly going to keep evolving.